Hello, my name is Kevin Young. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Today's program, Juneteenth, Connecting the Historic to the Now, is part of the museum's celebrations around Juneteenth. Often known as Emancipation Day, Juneteenth is a celebration of resilience. It marks the date in 1865 when enslaved communities in Galveston, Texas, learned the Civil War had ended and that they were free from slavery nearly 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Joining me today are three scholars who will help us understand the historical, political, and cultural significance of this holiday, and maybe a little bit about food too. Let me begin by introducing our distinguished panel, all three of whom have books on our Juneteenth book list we've just released. Annette Cordon-Reed. Annette Cordon-Reed is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University. She was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011 and is a member of the Academy's Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. She's the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, and the newly published On Juneteenth. Please also welcome Imani Perry. Imani is the Hughes-Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She's a scholar of law, literary and cultural studies, and an author of creative nonfiction. I love her book on Lorraine, Looking for Lorraine. It's so wonderful. Her writing and scholarship primarily focus on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination. Jelani Cobb. Now, Jelani is the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. He's contributed to The New Yorker since 2012 and has been a staff writer since 2015. He writes frequently about race, politics, history, and culture, and he's the recipient of a 2015 Hillman Award for Opinion and Analysis Writing. So let's get started. Annette, your recent book is so wonderful on Juneteenth, and you discuss the origins of Juneteenth in Texas, where you're from, in your new book. It's also part memoir. It tells us a lot about your family, which was fascinating. And can you tell us a little bit about Juneteenth's origins and how you personally celebrated Juneteenth?
Mm-hmm. Well, growing up, we celebrated Juneteenth eating barbecue, what people call soul food, a Southern cuisine, hot tamales, which my mother made, which it shows the Latino influence and indigenous influence in Texas. It celebrated the day in 1865 when Major General Gordon Granger came to Galveston and announced that slavery was over in Texas. People had heard this before. I mean, Galveston was a port city, and port cities can be one step ahead of people in lots of ways with information. But it was nevertheless a day of happiness and jubilation. But it was also a time period, I should say, when many of the people who had been enslavers and actually whites in the area who were quite hostile to the celebration. So it was a day of hope, and I say a day of hope and hostility. And we've celebrated that ever since, people in Texas.
And you celebrate with barbecue goat, is that right? As well as red drink? Am I right about that?
Well, our family didn't do the goat, but that was one of the things that was on the menu. Strawberry red soda water. We called it soda water back in those days. And I'm told that the red is supposed to symbolize the blood of enslaved people. Now, I don't know if that is something that has been grafted onto the holiday since then, but people, for example, also ate strawberry pie. So red figures in the story, in the story of Juneteenth, in the culinary choices that people made. That and firecrackers.
Well, it's funny because
which is unimaginable
I was
to
talking
me that
with,
below the age of 10, I was going to say it's funny that below the age of 10, I actually was allowed to play with firecrackers. We don't do that now.
Yeah, I think I started with firecrackers, pretty young, 6, 8, something like that, certainly. Well,
I think we need a disclaimer here that we do not endorse this.
I don't endorse it. I'm not endorsing it. I would not allow my kids to play with firecrackers, but that was a different time.
Sure. My grandfather would bring out a coal from the wood burning stove in Louisiana because they would pop firecrackers at Christmas time, and that's what you lit the firecrackers off of if you didn't have, another way to do it, which doesn't seem wise. Don't try this at home, but it was how we did it then. We also, the red drink thing is a real interesting question, which we were talking about on a conversation that's happening this weekend, Juneteenth, with Adrian Miller about the story of red drink and how it got to be. And so that's really interesting for people can tune in. But he traces it to hibiscus drinks and various traditions. And as he says, red isn't just a color for Black folks, it's also a flavor. So one of the things I want to think about is the way that Juneteenth is tied in this recent iteration, let's say, last year, when people started paying national attention to it. And I wonder how you feel about that, its national attention recently, but also it commemorates something that's a little complicated, as you know. As you said, it's hope and hostility, but also it's a delayed announcement. So there's this irony almost built into Juneteenth. And I wonder what the panel thinks about this current celebration of it and also this delay in our freedom or letting us know about freedom. Imani, what do you think?
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, for me, it is one of those holidays that fits into the dream deferred motif, to borrow language from Langston Hughes, of Black American life, right? The sort of the dynamic between, moments of victory and retrenchment, or the long freedom struggle, right? The 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps forwards, 3 steps back. The kind of Sisyphean cyclical path. And so, in this, I think it's not incidental that in this moment where we're living through this kind of horrific choreography, right, of killings of unarmed Black people, right, repeated in this era that was supposed to represent so much hope, that Juneteenth becomes the holiday that captures the imagination. And I think, at best, there's a kind of, I think, skepticism that often Black folks have kind of organically and wisely about sort of mainstream adoptions of our rituals, that whether or not it's going to be taken seriously, whether it's just going to be commercialized, or whether, it'll just be a symbolic effort. But I do think there's something significant about this holiday being embraced at this moment, because it tells the story of a historical event that is a disruption of a kind of standard model of America, towards a more perfect union model of American history. The complication in it, I do think, is instructive for us in this moment, right? That freedom promised is a long time coming, right? Frequently.
Jelani, how do you take it?
I mean, it's complicated, because at one point I remember saying that Juneteenth delivers what the 4th of July allegedly delivered. And that if we were looking for a kind of true North Star for our, ideas of liberty and freedom, then it would be found in the 6th month of the year, not in the 7th. And I thought that it should be celebrated nationally. But in retrospect, I think that was a naive thing to say. Because, for one, we don't really know how to commemorate, at least not with gravitas. For Memorial Day, we go out and buy things. For Thanksgiving, we eat and then we go out and buy things. We have Martin Luther King Day sales now. And I'm not certain that the country at large has the moral maturity or authority to recognize Juneteenth for what it actually suggests, what it actually conveys. And then beyond that, there's a dynamic that troubles me about the history, the way that we confront the troublesome history in this country. and it's connected to the views of Abraham Lincoln. You know, woe be unto you if you're ever critical to Abraham Lincoln, a figure for whom there's a lot to criticize, a lot to praise too, but certainly a lot to criticize as well. And the reason I think that Lincoln has operated and kind of held the psychological position that he holds in America is that he allows people to be redeemed, to focus on the end of slavery, not the persistence of slavery, not the centuries of subjugation that preceded it. As long as you have this one person who can be the figure that you associate with, I would have been Abraham Lincoln. I would have been that person. And it allows America to think of itself redemptively. And I think that in the light of that, with Juneteenth, we would continue that in a bigger sense to focus on how slavery ended and not focus upon the reasons that it persisted for as long as it did, and the reasons that, as Frederick Douglass predicted at the end of the Civil War, he said, this old snake will find new skin, the ways in which the regime of slavery was resurrected after the formal demise that we recognize in 1865. And so for all of those reasons, I've become, not even as a person who's a Texan, you know, just as a Black person, I've become kind of jealous of Juneteenth in the sense of protective of the idea of it and proprietary about it in a way that I think has surprised even me. I didn't anticipate feeling this way.
Well, Annette, you mentioned in your book that you felt proprietary at first about Juneteenth getting known more. Do you still feel that way, or are you thinking about it as a shared holiday? I certainly celebrated it for some time now. I don't know if that's because of my Louisiana roots or just Ralph Ellison, or just wanting to celebrate this moment.
Well, yeah, I did. I grew up thinking that this was something that belonged to Black Texans, and then it belonged in Texas to all Texans when it was made a state holiday in 1979, and I guess that became official in 1980. Yeah, I think I've come around to the idea that now I think all but 3 states have some form of recognition of Juneteenth, and there is something about the commercialization of it. And it's going to be commercialized. This is the United States of America. There's not going to be anything that's not commercialized. So that's that. Put it there. If you can commercialize Christmas, you can commercialize anything. But I think I understand Jelani's concerns, but I really do think that so many people in Texas. I think of Opal Lee, the centenarian, who I'm going to be on a program with, she started at 89, a crusade to make Juneteenth a national holiday because of her connection, her generation's connection, probably thinking about her mother and her mother's mother, what the day meant to them. And I think about my great-grandmother talking about what it meant to her and her mother. There are going to be people who are going to do it the wrong way, the way we think to be the wrong way. But I think there are going to be enough people. We have an opportunity to make some inroads educationally, and we can tell these stories. We can talk about the problem with Juneteenth as an out-and-out celebration when there was violent reaction to it on the part of white Texans. But this is an occasion, it's how you do it. This is an occasion to talk about those things and to keep it just among Black Texans or among ourselves. I don't think it allows for, I think this story allows for opening up the conversation, and we can talk about the things we want to talk about. I know most African Americans are not going to talk about Juneteenth as a day when everything was made all right, because we know that that's not true. To me, it's really about trying to connect to the feelings of those people at the time who found out that they were no longer by law going to be treated as chattel. They knew it was going to be a struggle, but that really meant something to them. The Black men who pooled their resources and bought land in Houston and created Emancipation Park for a public celebration. I think it would be amazing to think how they would view the idea that this might be something that could be considered a national holiday at some point, or would be happy that as many states as are doing it now are celebrating.
Can I revise my answer? I think that our sole hope for having an ethical representation of this holiday lies in as many people as possible purchasing Annette's book on Juneteenth and reading this wonderful slim volume. The entire crusade to have this work is contingent upon you going out and buying this book and giving it to as many people as possible. So
thank you, Jelani.
That's my revised answer.
Thank you, Jelani. Although thinking about the national holiday was not on my mind when I was writing this book, but it just comes in handy.
I would just say really quickly, I knew about Juneteenth. I have family in Houston, but I did not grow up with any kind of celebration of Juneteenth. The closest sort of formal celebration of that would be Emancipation Day programs in Boston when I was a teenager, celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was the kind of like vigil over New Year's Eve, and with a kind of elaborate program. And but I do think I guess I'd say one of the things that I think is also meaningful is that there's something that's happening with the African-American traditions of commemoration that are coming into public view, even this kind of correction of the historical narrative behind Memorial Day, understanding more about Black History Month, not, the commercial form, but like the Negro History Week that. And so Juneteenth is a part of that. And I do think as a cultural matter, right, which is overlap, but is somewhat distinct. And I think this goes again to the point of how important this book of Annette's is also to have an understanding of the cultural significance of practices of commemoration, not just as sort of dispassionate holidays, but as ways of bolstering communities that are still in struggle.
And connections among the generations too.
Yes.
It's one of the things I say in the book is I could, kick myself for having my great grandmother live till I was 11 and being so insouciant about the stuff that she was telling me that I would love to have her back now to ask questions. And the idea of keeping those traditions together and also having African-American people all around the country making a connection to those things and the rituals that they engage in. I guess in Richmond, April 3rd is the day that they celebrate. And then what you're talking about, Emancipation Day, having all those things together and seeing the points of commonality, how they differ, how they're similar. I think it's useful for the African-American community.
Just this spring, it's been powerful to see the way that we, for instance, did something around the Tulsa Massacre. Obviously, our museum is invested in all of what you're saying in terms of celebrating and marking and the generations. And I've been thinking a lot about that in connection with Juneteenth. Here we have this centuries-old tragedy, violence, this massacre, and then we have this celebration of freedom. And of course, last year was in the midst of the protests around George Floyd's killing. How do we make sense of all of this history, the history of Tulsa, the history of Juneteenth, but also this not even long ago history, the history we're living through? How do we connect those, and how do viewers who've been contending with a virus, the twin pandemics of racism and COVID, how do we help them through this moment? It's an easy question. You guys can fix it all for us in this.
Fix it all for us.
I think, right, part of the way we have to think about it is question about the uses of history. And I think oftentimes, we have the kind of colloquial narrative of history is to see it as just kind of a series of events. But of course, we're always telling histories in order to be able to both understand and also hopefully to produce, the good society or the good world, right? And so to use, and I don't mean that in a kind of overtly ideological sense, but just in a sense of learning from the past in order to think about what confronts us today. And so, I do think that there's a response that can be just absolute frustration, which is why are we still fighting so many of these same struggles? But then there's another side that I think is about how to sustain some degree of resilience. I think, as Annette said, to learn from previous generations, to not presume that that the knowledge that came from the past is not relevant to what we're trying to figure out how to do now. And particularly, and I think this, for me, is key as a parent, is about how do we help young people make sense of the internal contradiction, right, between the narrative of the egalitarian, multiracial, progressive society and the reality of pervasive and persistent inequality. And so I do think, and I think not just for Black young people, but for young people, period, that becomes sort of part of the function of all of this. So, and I don't mean to be romantic about it, but it's sort of, I guess the answer is, yet again, it's in our hands, right? What we're going to do with this past and present.
Yeah, one of the most poignant moments in working on the book was finding my great-great-grandfather on a voter registration list in 1867 in Texas. And I think about a person who, what a symbol of what an act of hope that was. Somebody saying, I'm a citizen of this country, I'm a citizen of this state, and I'm going to exercise the franchise, right? I'm going to be a part of it. And to know that just a little more than a decade after that, all of this was snatched away. And Jim Crow is put in place and voter suppression comes in. And then we have the big battle in the 50s and the 60s and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And we think that that part of the story has been settled. And here we are now down in Texas with efforts at voter suppression that are, I believe, put in place because of the enormous rise in participation on the part of people of color in voting during the last election. And this is a response to it, not just in Texas, there are other places as well. And as she was saying, that it's just, you think about a continuous struggle, and thinking of an African-American man in 1867 who has the hope, some might say temerity, to want to participate and to say he's going to participate and be active, that we can do the same ourselves. We have to stand up to the efforts that are being made down there now to try to take us back to, as near to 1860s, as far as I can tell from some people's attitudes. So it's the link to the past and the present, and white supremacy, the idea of a racial hierarchy that slavery helped to put in place and helped to maintain, that we haven't rid ourselves of. And that's a reality that we have to talk about. And so if you could look at the past and look at the connections to the present, you'll see that this is still an issue for us. And as much as many people want to think that this is a thing of the past, it's not. Attitudes about race and Black inferiority and whether or not we are truly part of the American polity, we're still arguing about that in 2021.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I think these things are like very deep within the American genome, and the way that it moves through history and is transmitted from generation to generation is through denial. And I witnessed that firsthand when I was in Tulsa last week. I had two different conversations with white people who, after I talked with them for a little while, would kind of be candid and just say, well, I'm not sure that it was as bad as they say that it was, or I'm not sure that these things actually happened. And I think that some of that was racial, absolutely. I also think that this was a kind of immune response that people were having to a feeling that the version of the country that they knew, what they'd always been taught, what they'd been taken for granted, had come under attack. And they couldn't expand their consciousness to countenance the idea that this country was capable of not only committing such an atrocity, but burying it, erasing it, denying any culpability in it, and then just continuing on about its merry way. And I think that there are lots of African Americans who have never had the difficulty in understanding that this is the country we live in. So I think what George Floyd did was exposed to the world because of the video, because of the excruciating nature of his death, exposed to the world a reality that we've always known and that has been illustrated again and again in the history. And I mean, I think that's bleak and that's difficult. But the other part of it is, you know, what I take from it is the resilience that people have had to pull ourselves up from the mat each time we've been knocked down and continue fighting. And I think that that's the most crucial thing. And quite frankly, as a kind of segue, it's one of the things I find most valuable about the museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that you come out of that with a sense not of what's been done to us, but what we have done of our own volition and what we have tried to achieve and tried to turn this country into against great odds.
I mean, that's what Du Bois's point about African Americans being the people who are, we're the carrying the torch for the ideals of the Declaration more than anybody. But I think your point, Jelani, is so right. And I was speaking to someone about this earlier this morning about this point about denial and how a lot of it some of it may come from outright racist views, but a lot of it is just that people see many of the people in the past, the white people in the past, as their ancestors. And these are people who are their family members, people whom they love and have been taught to respect, and to find out or to be asked to believe that these people did things that were heinous or terrible is difficult. And so there's a defensiveness. There's no way for them to separate out and say, I mean, they think you're attacking them personally, but you're attacking them. And we're saying, no. There were things called lynchings and people went with picnic baskets and we have pictures of them doing this. Mm-hmm. And it's just too much, I think, for some people to take. And then they say, well, you're exaggerating. That was not something that happened very often. And we know that Tulsa-like things happened all across the South, where Black people were run out of counties, run out of towns, and their property taken over. And it's just difficult for people to accept that because they think it's a judgment on them. And you have to find some way to say, you know, yes, those are your ancestors. You choose to make that kind of association with those people. But there were whites in the past who didn't carry on that way. There were whites in the past who were unionists in Texas, and we don't hear about them. And to some degree, some of these people may have championed some of the rights of African American people. They don't have to identify with their ancestors who were doing all of these, you know, things that today that we deplore, but they really do see it. Many of them do see it as an attack upon them personally, and that's a reason for denial.
Can I add one quick thing to this? And that's really a wonderful point summation of this. I think that if none of us knew anything about lynching, just taking that one example, and someone told you that hundreds of townspeople, respectable citizens, and people from far and wide would take trains to come to a town and pack picnic baskets in order to watch a human being be set on fire, castrated, and shot, and then they would divvy up the body parts at the end and go home, we would tell you that this was a bad script for a horror movie. Like, no one would believe that this actually happened if you weren't from a community that actually had to countenance this and come up with strategies to defend yourself, knowing that this was actually the reality. Like, it seems absurdist on the face of it. And you almost have a sense of empathy for people who don't believe it, because who would?
I think you're talking about something from the Middle Ages, some medieval thing that's happening. And what do you do for a town like my own that I talk about, where a man was burned at the stake on the courthouse square? How do you recover from that? What does that do to a culture? What kind of cultural memory seeps into all of the people there? Even at moments of peace, you know, well, when I was a kid, you understood that there is this undercurrent of potential threat. And you knew that that kind of ugliness was still there. Some of the people who participated in that may still have been alive, or who witnessed that were still alive. I mean, you can't, things like that can't happen and then just disappear and not shape the consciousnesses of white people and Black people. And you're right, Jelani. Who would think that something like that would happen in supposedly civilized modern time? But it did.
Well, I think you raise an important point about the role of public history in this, and how public history can help us address these questions, and that these questions, if unaddressed, are still there. And I wonder, Imani, how you view public history and its role, and some of these questions that are being raised by the other panelists.
I mean, I'll say, I think public history is almost always going to be contested history. I think that there are kind of, national narratives, mythologies, ideological commitments that go along with the nation state. There's something particular, though, about the United States in that there's this sort of internal, a built-in community, Black folks, who are built into the very construction of the nation state as inferior, as outside full legal recognition. And so there's this kind of internal tension that I think is part of what we've been discussing. And I do think that there are virtues to actually both giving up, to borrow from Baldwin, the American desire for innocence all the time, right? Which is part of why there's this repetition of a sense of disbelief, because there is a commitment to, well, I had nothing to do with this, right? More than how am I implicated? How is my life shaped by this particular history? And there's also, I think, we have a responsibility to actually acknowledge the contested nature of history. I think that would require a more sophisticated public in the way that, and Jelani made a beautiful point earlier about how resistant we are to more kind of sophisticated stories, but I think that's really important. I was just thinking about being at the lynching memorial in Montgomery, and the most recent time. And there's a story both times actually that I went there that stuck in my craw about a teacher, a Black woman who was a teacher in Birmingham, Alabama, my birthplace, who was lynched because she scolded some white boys who were throwing rocks at people, right? And so, so to go to the point, both the what is sort of reckless, grotesque, and also was just and terrorizing, really in the terrorizing sense, right? And also built into the very structure of the nation, right? I think it also should make us question, what do we mean by the term civilization, right? When you have these kinds of things structured inside. And so that's a difficult thing to be honest about, given that nation states rely on national mythologies, but we would all be better for that, for a more honest rendering in public.
Jelani, you said once that all history is revisionist history. How do you square that with public history?
Well, what I was saying making that statement in response to the fact that when you present the fuller accounts of what's happened in the past, particularly in this country, you are likely to encounter the charge revisionist history, and people mean that in a derogatory way. But anybody who works in the historical profession or is even kind of really familiar with it knows that all history is revision. We're constantly revising our understanding of the past. That's the whole point.
Yes.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, that's the point of it.
That's why we have more than one book on the Civil War, or
right.
more than one book, more than one book on anything.
Yeah.
Because we learn, or like the example I give my students is that there was one very dismissive and derisive perspective on Ulysses S. Grant near his death at the time he lived, and kind of people would refer to him as a drunk and so on. And later, when we developed a more sophisticated understanding of what PTSD was, we had a more empathetic understanding of what was going on with Ulysses S. Grant. And now the perspective we have on him, because it has been revised, is much more clarifying. We have a much more sophisticated understanding of who Ulysses S. Grant was. And that's what we're always doing. And so, but it's the difficulty, I think, happens that when we have scholars and we have communities where this revising and the kind of pushing forward of the narrative is happening, and we have a public that really doesn't understand what's happening. And so if we can talk just very briefly about the 1619 Project, that's part of what happened there. You know, there are plenty of historians, I mean, some things that people debate, but plenty of historians who found, you know, a lot to respect in that 1619 Project. But for people who were looking from the outside, they were like, oh, this is just revision. But it also falls into the same dynamic that we saw in 1995, when people were talking about the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb. We had that same sort of clash around commemoration. It happened in 1992, when we were talking about the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival. And then we had a similar clash. So we have one set of understandings that operate in a scholarly context, and a very different set of understandings that operate in the public context. And that's, again, where public history is the kind of right smack in the middle of those two things. So to echo Imani's point about public history being contested history, I think that's largely why we see it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Can
I know at for example, at places like Monticello, where they've changed the story that they tell about slavery at Monticello, there has, from the time they started doing it, a lot of pushback from members of the public who say, you know, I didn't come up here to talk about slavery, right? Coming up to a slave plantation and saying, I didn't come up here to talk about slavery. I came to talk about the cool clock and the china and the place settings and all those kinds of things. They're, you know, they have expectations, but the same token, there are a lot of members of the public who want that. So it's a question of who is the audience and who you're willing, you know, who are you playing to, for lack of a better word, who are you directing this for and directing this to? There's some people who want to know more, but there are other people who really want to stick with the old story about the, you know, the nature of slavery in this country, and one that downplayed the problems, the horrors of slavery.
Can I add something really quickly? Because I think it sort of echoes something that Jelani said earlier about the significance of the museum is that I think part of this story is also about Black archives and materials. And we have so many materials out there that have yet to be collected and organized and processed. And part of what I think is such an emotional experience about the museum, and it's extraordinary, you know, institutional structure, but also that there is this recognition that there are things that people preserved in their attics, in their drawers, that now we recognize are important for telling history. And I think we collectively need to continue to encourage our elders, members of our communities, to not just preserve, but also as scholars look to them for the work that we do, because there is so much that we don't yet have access to that is incredibly important for telling these stories.
That's so well said. You know, I don't want to say it again because you said it so well, but I think in many ways, history is also personal, of course, and these items, it's a community as well. And between the personal and the community comes this history that we very much rely on, and the objects, which I think people would be surprised if they haven't been, to see the range and the depth of them and how many amazing things people kept, as you said. But to see Harriet Tubman's shawl or to see her handkerchief, and I was thinking when I first heard about us having it and displaying it, like, think of the sweat and the tears that handkerchief saw. You know, and we have to, I think we are in such a fortunate position to be able to take care of it and show it. And then something about seeing those objects up close. And, you know, we also have digital access to those objects. helps you, I think, connect to that story in a way that sometimes telling it doesn't always. It often can transcend some of that denial, I suppose, you're talking about. It's hard to deny the object in the same way as the story, though, of course, the objects are telling the story.
Well, that's been one of the most amazing things about slavery scholarship, is the broadening of our understanding of what constitutes evidence, what the archive is, that you have to, necessity is the mother of invention. It's easy if you have a bunch of letters and you could just look at these letters and try to figure out what, and even then you don't really know what these people are. The letters are problematic in their own way too, but the idea of going through, looking at objects, material culture, foodways, all those kinds of things to tell a story about people who were left out, who weren't given the capacity, weren't given the opportunity to create a traditional type of archive. It's opened up other areas of scholarship as well, not scholarship about people other than elite whites, whites who are poor, Native peoples, all kinds of people. The historiography of slavery has opened so much up to people all around the profession.
Beautifully said. We have probably time for one more question. And the question I had is sort of related to, I guess, the distance of history and the now. And I was amazed to hear, Annette, you tell the story of integrating your school as a child. I think some people think that'd be a far away thing. And also I was struck by you talking about now your bust, an image of you is there in your town. Could you tell us about that and how you draw connections to that specific past of yours?
Well, I draw the connection in talking about my town and the history of my town and its tough racial history, and a moment in the 1960s when my parents were idealistic about the possibilities of the transformation of American society and decided to send me to the white school instead of the black school where my mother spoke. My mother taught, and she, she'd speak about, why they decided to do this, and my father did as well. Their ideas changed over time as they became somewhat disillusioned about the effects of integration in our town, the loss of role models for Black students when Black teachers were moved out of the classroom. My mother stayed in the classroom. The loss of a sense of mission that she had about teaching Black students. I mean, she loved all of her students, but she'd become a teacher because she was part of that generation that was sort of uplift the race. We're going to be doing things because we're moving forward. And she said, we can't talk to them the way we talked to them when we had them all together and say, you have to succeed. You have to do these things because we're a people on this journey, on this mission. So they sent me as a 6-year-old to first grade there. And I was by myself for the first year. And a couple of years later, the Supreme Court struck down the freedom of choice plans, which was how they were trying to get around Brown in Texas and other places as well. White parents would choose white schools and Black parents would choose Black schools. And my mother and father did something different. But it was, it was a tough time. I mean, I don't know that I have kids of my own now, and I wonder if I would do that, but we're not in that moment. This is the mid-60s, the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act. People were marching, they were in the thick of things. And I think at that time, they thought it was the thing to do. And I was a guinea pig for that. I made it through, and there were tough times, but there were good times as well. My teachers were fantastic. My first grade teacher, and I wonder now if the fact that my mother was a teacher influenced the way they did things, and there was some sort of sense of camaraderie. But it was rough, and it made me, I think, in a lot of ways, shape my personality in ways that are probably good and maybe sometimes bad.
Well, it's a wonderful part of your book. And I grew up in part in Topeka, Kansas with Linda Brown of Brown v. Board. And so this story touches us all in ways that isn't as far along or far away as we might think.
No, it's not. It isn't. We sat in the balcony when we went to the movie theater. We had separate waiting rooms. Again, I mean, after burning somebody on the courthouse square, other lynchings, all those kinds of things, even if technically, legally, you're supposed to be able to do things, the thought of provoking perhaps violence by challenging things too much was there. It continued. It continued to have this reputation as a really rough place. And there is apparently still, in recent times, there was some Klan activity in that area. But you're right, I have a mural and a bust in downtown. So I can't say that every single thing is the same. Some things have changed and some things have remained the same.
Yeah.
Well, my last question, I want to go around for everyone.
Can I just say we've been having this conversation about tearing down monuments, particularly in the South. I'm very happy to see that there are monuments that we are happy to see in there and kept in good condition and remaining there in perpetuity.
Yes. Well, the last question I have for y'all, I had to sneak one more in, is just, you've already addressed it a little bit, but do you think Juneteenth should be a national holiday? I'm going to start with Imani.
I must admit, I don't have a strong feeling about the question. What I feel strongly about is that the energy that led to us having this expansion of Juneteenth, such that it became the subject of common knowledge and appreciation, that energy, I hope, is sustained in the midst of this period of very intensive attack on voting rights, on efforts to address racial inequality, of efforts to be a more inclusive society in general. So I would say, one of the things that we never can fully anticipate is how forward movement is going to be slid back. I mean, that's in the doing. So we could have it become a national holiday and then see such an intense backlash that the meaning of that is kind of diminished. But I do think that there's something meaningful that happened over the last year, and I think it's incumbent upon us to sustain that energy.
Jelani, what do you think? We already said a little bit, but
I'll say I'm wary of it and worried, but I'll err on the side of optimism and say that in the way that we've treated Martin Luther King's Day as a day of service and recognition of the connection of his life, between his life and our ongoing struggle to achieve actual democracy in this country, that I think that if we can support ethical ways to recognize the implications of Juneteenth, then let's do it.
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Annette, last thoughts?
I would agree with him, with Jelani. I think we should take control of it. The people who have the capacity to write about the subject and to keep the issues that we've been talking about today in the forefront, I would be for it. I think there's so many people in Texas that I've been reading about this efforts who've been working a very, very long time for this, and it would mean a lot to them. It would be a victory to them. I think there should be a day to commemorate the feeling that people who were enslaved, many of them had upon learning about this. We should pause and reflect on that. So yeah, I think it should be a national holiday, but we should be, as Jelani is saying, pretty vigilant. We should ride herd on it as much as historians and journalists and people who know the real stories and make the connections that we've been made. We should really be vigilant about making sure that it lives up to the momentous nature of the occasion and to the hopes of the people who first heard about it in 1865.
Well, thank you so much. Well said, everyone. It's so good to have you, Annette, Imani, Jelani. The museum thanks you very much, and thank you to the audience for listening to us. Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Take care.